Greetings, fellow detectives. Wizard Kitten here, bringing you a new Nancy Drew analysis video. In my last Nancy Drew analysis, I laid out my argument for the only 3 Nancy Drew PC game soundtracks, at least in my opinion, that did not work. So therein lies the problem for this video. Only 3 of them didn't work. How on earth am I supposed to pick a top 10? The truth is that I love the other 30 soundtracks, and I would be truly devastated to have them removed from my life. The vast majority of the Nancy Drew soundtracks are masterpieces that beautifully convey the locations, emotions, histories, and complexities of their own individual mysteries. As I mentioned in my last video, I believe that a huge reason for this is that most of the Nancy Drew soundtracks were brought to life by 2 different composers during 2 long, uninterrupted eras. Kevin Manthei from Secrets Can Kill to Alibi and Ashes, and Thomas Regan from Tomb of the Lost Queen to Sea of Darkness. We were therefore blessed with 2 incredibly talented composers who had the opportunity to really get to know Nancy and her mysteries. These aren't just boring little computer games that need some background music. Far from it. The Nancy Drew games are meticulously crafted mysteries with deep stories and compelling plots that require incredible soundtracks in order to enhance the storytelling. It's clear that Manthei and Regan took their jobs very seriously, because it's really difficult for me to find anything to criticize within the soundtracks. Which brings us back to the task at hand. I have decided to use a tier maker from tiermaker.com to analyze the greatness that is these soundtracks. You will notice that there is not a great deal of delineation in my categories. We have pure perfection, amazing, and clearly great. I can't be any meaner to them than that, okay? That's the best I can do. It even pains me to put some of them in just the great category. It's just so hard because each soundtrack is designed to suit a different game, a different mood, and a different style, and almost every soundtrack accomplishes that goal. So here's the best I can offer. Let's start by putting the only 3 unsuccessful soundtracks down here. I discussed the soundtracks for Ransom of the 7 Ships, The Shattered Medallion, and Midnight in Salem in detail in my last Nancy Drew analysis video, so I highly recommend checking that one out first. It will be linked in a card in the upper corner. With those 3 out of the way, we are now left with 30 remaining Nancy Drew games. I have allowed myself to place 10 at each tier level. Pure perfection will be reserved for soundtracks that I simply cannot live without, and I would cry if you told me I had to abandon them. These are soundtracks that I listen to regularly and enjoy without the context of the game. Within the context of the game, they expertly assist with storytelling and building of atmosphere flawlessly. Amazing is the middle tier. These are soundtracks that I truly appreciate for their brilliance. They are an integral part of the games to which they belong and are crucial at building the mood. But they aren't the ones that I'm obsessed with, in that I don't gravitate toward them all of the time when I'm listening to the soundtracks. But they can still be enjoyed without their context. Clearly great is for soundtracks that I think accomplish exactly what they need to accomplish for their game, but the music itself isn't exactly to my personal taste, which means I don't find myself enjoying the music out of the context of the game. As a fun little addition, I will be playing my favorite song from each soundtrack in the background during this video, as that game's soundtrack is discussed. Track titles will be visible on the screen. So without further preamble and fearful procrastination, let's get to sorting in chronological order. Secrets Can Kill and Secrets Can Kill Remastered. One of you wonderful fellow detectives pointed out to me that the soundtracks for Secrets Can Kill and Secrets Can Kill Remastered are not exactly the same, but there is a great deal of overlap, so I'm going to rate them the same way. I am much more familiar with Secrets Can Kill Remastered than the original Secrets Can Kill. For this first game, I am going to unfortunately have to place them within the clearly great category. Again, this does not mean that this is a bad soundtrack, because this is still clearly a great soundtrack. It just is not one that I find myself listening to a great deal. I think the location of a high school was conveyed nicely by the music itself. There was a very mysterious feel to the music itself, but beyond that, there wasn't anything that really made the soundtrack stand out significantly in a way that really hits my nostalgia. The soundtrack absolutely does its job, but it's not one that I'm obsessed with. Stay tuned for Danger. I did a lot of thinking about which soundtracks deserve to be in my pure perfection level, and honestly, this is the first one that gets to live there. First things first, I think the soundtrack for Stay Tuned for Danger is expertly done in that the music very clearly gives us a feeling of being in New York and within the film world. The soundtrack has this almost jazzy sort of feel, which gives us a film noir detective vibe, which is really what makes me connect with the soundtrack so deeply. I love that sassy historical detective feel, peering around the corners of buildings, picking locks to get into offices, interviewing overly dramatic suspects. The music just gets that across in such a cool and unique way, but it still has a really fun lightness to it that makes it very pleasant to listen to outside of the game as well. I actually really love this one. Message in a Haunted Mansion. I barely have to hesitate for this one. Message in a Haunted Mansion is pure perfection for me, hands down. I love this game so much, and a big reason for that is that I can instantly transport myself to the Golden Gardenia purely by imagining the soundtrack. Not only do we get these really cool, wispy, haunted, dusty, historical vibes from the music, but we also get periodic influences from Chinese music to help really drive home the idea that we are in a mansion in San Francisco and that this mansion is bursting with mystery and history and ghosts of the past. The music makes us feel unsettled at the same time that it reminds us how beautiful the bygone era of this mansion was. I'm simply obsessed with how the soundtrack makes me feel like I am truly in a Victorian mansion, back in Victorian times, and I can't get enough of it within the game and even when I'm not in the game. Treasure in the Royal Tower. I feel like some of you are going to be so upset at me for this, but I am going to put the soundtrack for Treasure in the Royal Tower in the clearly great category. Again, this does not mean that it is a bad soundtrack. Please do not come for me. It is in fact an excellent soundtrack. It does exactly what it needs to do. The soundtrack feels so grand and regal and really places us in a castle atmosphere while simultaneously driving home the atmosphere of France and historical France, no less. When I hear the music from the soundtrack, I am immediately transported to the halls of Wickford Castle. Marie Antoinette is immediately brought to mind. The mysteries of her treasure and her past are also beautifully conveyed. However, outside of the game, the soundtrack ends up being a little too strong for my personal taste. It is extremely grand. It's just a little bit too marvelous with all of its grandeur, and as someone who generally prefers more subtlety in her music, I find myself skipping over the Treasure in the Royal Tower soundtrack fairly frequently when I'm listening in my free time. And again, it's truly beautiful, it's truly wonderful. I love the soundtrack, but for me, I have to rank them. When I have to make these tough choices, it has to be clearly great for me. The final scene, this is another one that really pains me to just call clearly great because it is so spectacular, just like Treasure in the Royal Tower. The soundtrack for the final scene has an ethereal circus carnival performance theatrical sound. It is at once haunting and yet also jolly. It brings to mind the idea that the Royal Palladium used to be a beautiful place for people to find enjoyment. It used to be a place of art and grandeur and socializing and excitement, and it is now just a crumbling, dilapidated, empty version of what it used to be. The music does this in such a gorgeous way by playing around with crescendo and decrescendo within those moments of joy so that we're almost getting hints of that past while still very much being reminded of the dire nature of our present. It is an extremely successful soundtrack. But outside of the game, I do not listen to it as frequently because it relies a lot on that carnival sound, and that just isn't something that I enjoy listening to outside of a setting in which it is appropriate. Again, it pains me to have to put it here, but I do think that if I'm being honest with myself, this is where it needs to go. Secret of the Scarlet Hand. This is our first soundtrack that we will put in the amazing category. I think the way that this soundtrack was done is exactly what needed to happen. There is an unmistakable influence of Mayan culture in the music. Of course, it's probably pretty unlikely that we know exactly what Mayan music would have sounded like in the past, but the way it was done convinces me that this is exactly what it should have sounded like. When I hear the soundtrack, I feel like I am in the deepest part of Mexico and completely enfolded by its history. Just like the final scene, I think the music is so successful at giving us hints of the past while still reminding us periodically of our tasks in the present. The use of vocals as well as percussion instruments, I think, are particularly well done in this soundtrack. And beyond that, I find myself thoroughly enjoying the soundtrack even outside of the context of Beach Hill. While it isn't one that is firmly lodged in my soul and therefore not quite pure perfection, it is still definitely amazing. Ghost Dogs of Moon Lake. Just like Message in a Haunted Mansion, I do not need to hesitate with this soundtrack. Ghost Dogs of Moon Lake is clearly a pure perfection soundtrack. What I love so much about this soundtrack is that it changes so clearly at different moments within the game and at different times within the game. And so it's extremely integral in creating a sense of place, a sense of actual belonging. The sounds of the forest at night are drastically different from the sounds of the forest during the day, which is exactly how forests are in real life. Growing up in Minnesota, you really come to appreciate the sounds of trees and lakes and all of the creatures and critters that call them home. And to have those sounds so beautifully blended into a soundtrack that simultaneously includes music that makes us feel terrified of hauntings and aggressive ghosts and roaring 20s speakeasies, it's just so incredible. All of the tracks are different and yet incredibly cohesive. They all work very well together despite the very particular and specific roles that each of the individual songs play. I listen to the soundtrack all the time outside of the game, and the way that I know that it's a pure perfection soundtrack is because I will be hiking in a place very similar to Moon Lake, and the music finds its ways into my ears. It just pops into my brain simply because it was able to create such a powerful association. The soundtrack really is pure perfection in my mind. The Haunted Carousel. This one is very similar to the final scene in my opinion in that it expertly sets the scene and does exactly what it needs to do as a soundtrack. However, what that means for this particular game is that a lot of the tracks end up being very carnival-centric with a twist of haunting energy. This works perfectly for a game that is set in a historic amusement park. The tracks instantly evoke a feeling of wandering around on cement pathways, eating popcorn, playing carnival games, and riding on a carousel. Furthermore, the soundtrack does a fabulous job of still adding in a spooky feeling to such a happy, jaunty environment and is truly very successful. However, do I find myself reaching for carnival music in my spare time? It's just not something that I want to listen to over and over again out of the context of the game, which is why the Haunted Carousel is placed in my clearly great tier. Danger on Deception Island. This is a soundtrack that I would find very difficult to live without. When it is a rainy, foggy day, Siren Dirge immediately pops into my head and I am wandering around the beaches of Snake Horse Harbor, collecting clams and looking at the lighthouse. The association truly is that powerful because each of the tracks evoke the locations so successfully. Every single one of the tracks has this ethereal, dim, foggy feel to it, and yet we still get this energy of sailor tunes to help balance that out. I think the soundtrack is just so successful because it ebbs and flows so effortlessly in between each of the different locations. Like the music so successfully makes me feel one certain way when I'm in the Hot Kettle Cafe, a completely different way when I'm kayaking in the harbor, and yet again a completely different way when I am wandering through Andy's Whale Museum. I also really love and admire the use of actual whale noises within the soundtrack itself. It really is just truly beautiful, and therefore a soundtrack that I consider pure perfection. Secret of Shadow Ranch. This is a soundtrack that easily could have ended up in the clearly great category for me personally, because country music happens to be one of my least favorite kinds of music. I'm just not a fan in general. However, the way the music is used in Secret of Shadow Ranch is the epitome of success. It's just truly fantastic. All of the individual tracks set the scene so perfectly, where you can really get traditional country music and acoustic guitar in one place, and yet very eerie, haunting electric guitar and other southern influences in another place. The contrast between locations as portrayed through the music is beautiful. But what's even more beautiful is that the tracks still meld together in a completely cohesive way in order to tell the story. The ranch is supposed to be a safe haven, while the desert is supposed to be lonely and dangerous, and further still, the ghost town is supposed to be completely abandoned and otherworldly. The soundtrack does this so successfully that even though I don't personally like country music, I still love listening to this soundtrack because I am immediately transported to a beautiful desert, looking for petroglyphs, or imagining myself being brave enough to poke around a dilapidated ghost town. It's really beautiful. It's pure perfection. Curse of Blackmore Manor. For the third time in a row now, we have to go with pure perfection. This was Her Interactive's first non-United States mystery, which meant that it was the first time that the music really got to play with a location. I think the historical depth and feeling of royalty were captured beautifully with this soundtrack, along with the medieval Renaissance time-specific sounds. So not only do we feel intimately like we are in England in a creepy old historical manor, but we also feel transported in time as we unravel the mysteries of the Penvillin family through time. Despite feeling very grand and royal, I think this music is still very accessible and works really beautifully out of its context. It has this slow, mournful, and reflective tone to it that really captures the imagination in a really special way. So while I can very specifically tie each track to the different places around Blackmore Manor, I can also enjoy it even if I am not wandering the halls of the manor, which makes it pure perfection in my book. Secret of the Old Clock. This game is going to go in the amazing category. I think Secret of the Old Clock was able to do something really special in that it was set in 1920s, 1930s-ish America, and therefore was able to use the music of that time as a starting point. I think the soundtrack does this beautifully in that we are instantly transported to Titusville circa this time period purely through the jazzy vibes and bouncy beats. I think the music is also especially successful for this game because it is one of the daytime-only games, so it's generally lighter in tone, and I think the music accompanies that beautifully while still giving us just enough suspense, especially in the places where it really matters, like in secret passageways. It still gives some intensity while never letting us forget where we are within the game itself. I think it's a great homage to the era in which Nancy was created, and the soundtrack as a whole is a beautiful set of music that I think accomplishes its goal flawlessly. That being said, it's not one that I listen to a great deal. However, it is one that I think is very successful. Last Train to Blue Moon Canyon. I feel like this might be another one where fellow detectives will disagree with me, in that I am not going to place this game in the pure perfection category, rather I will be placing it in the amazing category. Similarly to Secret of the Old Clock, I think Last Train to Blue Moon Canyon hits every single beat that it needs to hit. I think the haunting tracks that are supposed to evoke our idea of Camille with simple piano are truly beautiful, and contrasts really nicely with the more industrial sounds that are supposed to give us an idea of a train and momentum and movement. There are some country-esque styles to the music, and I think the way that the music shifts from location to location, and even within the train from car to car, is absolutely fantastic. The soundtrack does exactly what it needs to do to convey the mood of this game, which is a sense of a lost past and the idea of moving forward just like a train would. The reason I put this soundtrack in amazing comes down to the fact that some of the more train-like tracks themselves can be a bit jarring in the sense that they almost push you forward in a way, which again makes perfect sense for the game and the mystery, but for music that I personally listen to is not something that I typically seek out. However, this is another spectacular soundtrack, and I don't think that it does anything wrong, really. Danger by Design. This is a soundtrack that I really loved and I feel like maybe sometimes gets overlooked, but I think as the second international mystery, this soundtrack played so beautifully with the sounds of France and was so successful in evoking that atmosphere. When I am trotting through Square du Vert Galant Park or when I'm hanging out at the Moulin, the music reminds me that I am always in France. The tracks all have this romantic and sensual feel to them, while utilizing instruments that really reflect the culture and mood of France. The soundtrack for this game is also very melodic and emotional in a way, which I think goes along really nicely with that idea of expression that is often associated with France. The tracks all go really well with one another, but they also are distinct enough that they each have their own unique sound, which I appreciate. There is nothing that I can objectively find wrong with Danger by Design, but I also would not say that it hits my nostalgia in the same way that some of the pure perfection soundtracks do. Creature of Puu Cave. This soundtrack is going to go into the clearly great category. Unlike Ransom of the Seven Ships, which I described in my video about the only 3 bad Nancy Drew soundtracks, I think that Creature of Puu Cave is an example of doing a tropical soundtrack well, in that it still has those beachy vibes and really makes you feel like you are enjoying a vacation in Hawaii, while still also mixing in very purposefully more spooky, jungle, intense vibes. I think the soundtrack really expertly mixes the styles and instruments that, at least to my untrained ear, feel like they evoke native Hawaii. I do sometimes feel like there's a bit of a dissonance between the happier, upbeat beach tracks and the more dangerous jungle and cave tracks, though that might just come down to how the mystery itself is structured to begin with rather than any faults of the soundtrack. Regardless, I have decided that it needs to live here. White Wolf of Icicle Creek. I really enjoy the way the soundtrack came together for this game. However, I do feel that it needs to live in the clearly great category because a great deal of the tracks are very similar, so much so that it is often difficult to tell them apart from one another. There isn't a great deal going on as far as variation within each individual track as well, but I still think that all of the songs in this soundtrack do a great job of getting across the idea of a cozy lodge or snowshoeing on a bitterly cold day. It's honestly impressive how 2 very different ideas, one very warm and comfortable and the other very cold and uncomfortable, can still have such cohesive sounds. I also like that each of the songs almost sounds like a footprint hitting snow, which is a really cool kind of way to convey the location of this game, which is snow-covered Alberta, Canada in winter. There's a magical feel to the soundtrack, which I think matches the theme of Isis the Wolf quite well, in that the idea is tossed around multiple times throughout the game that this wolf is almost supernatural in the way that it reacts and lives around humans. So I think that the soundtrack is extremely successful and does a lot of things very well, but just doesn't have quite enough variation for it to be amazing or pure perfection. Legend of the Crystal Skull. Now, as far as conveying the sound of New Orleans and voodoo and crypts to my untrained ear, I think this soundtrack is incredibly successful. I am, however, going to put it in the clearly great category because a number of the tracks, probably a majority of them, are not songs that I find myself listening to outside of the game's context really at all. The music, first of all, doesn't really vibe with my style in that there is a lot of dissonance within the songs, which is something that I generally avoid in music. It tends to make me feel weird and even a little bit anxious when beats and pitches are mixing and changing so frequently and sporadically. I think within the game, this is absolutely a great move because that's exactly how we are supposed to feel within the game. We are supposed to feel creeped out, we are supposed to feel uneasy, we are supposed to feel some suspense, that same kind of feeling that you get when the power goes out during a thunderstorm and you're all alone. That vibe that the soundtrack creates is absolutely fantastic, and I think that the soundtrack does exactly what it needs to do. However, I do not listen to it outside of the context of the game, and so clearly great it is. Phantom of Venice. This is another soundtrack that I think deserves to be in the amazing category, but just so happens to be one that I'm personally not super obsessed with. The music is excellent at capturing the vibe of Venice by using instruments and styles that feel completely Italian and really convey floating peacefully on a gondola and traipsing through a stunning piazza on a sunny afternoon. The game itself, being a primarily daytime game, lends itself really nicely to this light, airy, and yet still romantic kind of feeling, which I think the music balances out beautifully. The only reason that I can't really call it pure perfection is that the tracks don't necessarily come to mind as easily as those games that I include in the pure perfection category. I can recognize the music from Phantom of Venice quite quickly, but I can't generate it on my own, which means it doesn't feel quite as memorable to me. However, when I'm playing Phantom of Venice, does the soundtrack help set the scene? Does it help convey the mood? Does it aid in telling the story? Yes, absolutely. And so we have amazing. The Haunting of Castle Malloy. This game I am also going to put in the amazing category. I personally love the music in this mystery. I think the fact that it incorporates so many sounds of Ireland is really admirable and exciting. I think the setting is captured completely within the soundtrack itself, and every single trap really helps propel the story and complement the individual moments of the story in a really beautiful way. I can call to mind the songs that I hear when I'm walking through a bog, or trying to chase down some wily sheep, or spending time in the Screaming Banshee Inn. It feels extremely authentic, it feels really nicely developed, and I think there is a good variety to the music as well. Probably the reason that it doesn't become one of the pure perfection games for me comes down to the fact that a lot of the fiddle-inspired music is not music that I typically seek out. Again, because it kind of has more of that sporadic, chaotic feel, which just generally isn't something that I vibe with as far as music goes. That being said, I have absolutely no complaints about how the soundtrack was executed, and I think it does its job flawlessly. Skipping Ransom of the Seven Ships because that was included in my previous video, and moving on to Warnings at Waverly Academy. It is perhaps no surprise that my favorite game is considered a pure perfection soundtrack in my book. Honestly, the soundtrack plays a big role in me considering Warnings at Waverly Academy my favorite game to begin with, because it is basically everything that I want in a soundtrack. We have the extremely clever concept of having the soundtrack become part of the environment, because as you wander around on the second level of Ramsey Hall during the day, when Mel is practicing her cello, we hear her playing classical music. So not only is this included as part of the soundtrack, but it is also included quite literally as part of the story, which I think is absolutely mind-blowing and genius. When we don't hear Mel playing, we are treated to a beautiful variety of tracks that effortlessly sway from light and carefree, as many people assume high school age students to be, and deep and mysterious and full of complexity, which is perhaps more accurately what the high school experience is like. This captures the personalities of the students who attend Waverly, as well as the personality of the building itself, which we know is steeped in history and has its own compelling hidden secrets. Somehow the soundtrack manages to blend all of this together effortlessly. That sense of history, the mystery of Edgar Allan Poe, the drama between the students at Waverly, all of it is captured in these different scenes and the different days of the mystery. Each individual location is portrayed so beautifully through the music, and it is quite literally pure perfection for me. Trail of the Twister. I feel like I rag on this game quite a lot, but I honestly don't consider it a bad game, nor do I consider the music bad in any way. However, I am going to put the soundtrack in the clearly great category. This is definitely a personal taste thing in that the music for Trail of the Twister is very much bluegrass, country inspired, which as I mentioned before, just is not a kind of music that I personally enjoy, and so therefore I have a really hard time connecting to the soundtrack itself on a personal level. However, the soundtrack does do everything that it should do when conveying Oklahoma as a location and Tornado Alley in terms of suspense and danger, certainly. I think the soundtrack does a really great job of changing with the different levels of danger that we are supposed to expect throughout the game. We are treated to very different sounds when we are hanging out in Ma and Pa's general store than when we are actively chasing down a tornado, which is absolutely how it should be. But I think that the music does it in a really nice way and that the instruments are still the same, so there's a lot of connectivity in between the individual tracks within the soundtrack. Again, it does everything it needs to do, I just don't vibe with it personally, so we'll put it in clearly great. Shadow at the Water's Edge. This is one where if I had allowed myself more room in the pure perfection category, it easily would have continued to stay there. However, when making cuts, I had to recognize that a lot of the music in Shadow at the Water's Edge is not music that I enjoy out of the context of the game, because a great deal of it is meant to be unsettling, in that it has those abrupt changes in beat, in pitch, in volume, to create this static-like sound, which is something that I thoroughly enjoy when I'm exploring a haunted ryokan, but not necessarily something that I enjoy standing alone. With all that said, I think this is an incredibly successful soundtrack because what it does is utilize all of the sounds of historic Japan as well as all of the sounds of modern Japan, which is a huge subplot and undertone of the mystery itself, in that the family is being torn apart by the ideas of do we adhere to tradition or do we follow the changing tides of modern times. Modern Pop is one of my favorite songs within the entire Nancy Drew series, and it's something that I will blast on the radio while driving and just have the best time. While the tracks that play in the ryokan itself lend a really beautiful contrast because they are much more soothing, much more slow, much more lyrical, and yet still extremely creepy. The soundtrack is incredibly effective in conveying mood and location and vibe, and is one of the most successful overall, so I really have no problems with it beyond my own personal preferences. The Captive Curse. The big, bold, and brash sounds of Bavaria are captured so beautifully within this soundtrack. I think the sounds of Germany come through loud and clear in the soundtrack, but that's the key word for me personally, is loud and clear. A lot of the music for the soundtrack is really booming in a way that works really nicely for conveying the location of the game, but does not necessarily work really nicely for my very sensitive ears. I do love that the soundtrack is balanced out with a lot of really nice unsettling tracks, especially when we are wandering through the forest or the courtyard of Castle Finster, knowing full well that a monster could attack us at any time. The soundtrack is marvelous at conveying the vibe of the mystery and getting across that constant idea of fear, but also the passion of Germany and its culture. The soundtrack does exactly what it needs to do, but I can personally only call it clearly great because I listen to very little of it out of context. It works best within the halls of Castle Finster, not necessarily without. Alibi in Ashes. This may be controversial, maybe, but I consider this soundtrack to be pure perfection. It is just one of the most listenable soundtracks of the Nancy Drew series, in that I can listen to almost the entirety of the soundtrack outside the context of the mystery itself and still enjoy it almost to the same extent. Of course, I enjoy it more when it's within the mystery itself, because what it does is bring River Heights to life in a really exciting way. The music has this lightness to it that gives us kind of an idea of the face and facade of River Heights, and then has these undertones of the darkness and the prejudice and the judgments that can kind of come with that sort of very small, very tight-knit community where everyone knows everyone. They are two very separate ideas, but anyone who has grown up in a small town probably knows what I'm talking about. I also very much enjoy the police-inspired music and the detective-inspired tracks. They mesh very nicely with the more exploratory tracks and even some of the danger tracks. I think as a complete set, the music of this game just does everything it needs to do and is so pleasant to listen to that I would genuinely be extremely disappointed if I could never listen to the soundtrack again, which means that I have to put it in pure perfection. Tomb of the Lost Queen. This is another game that I feel like I unintentionally rag on quite a bit, even though I genuinely really enjoy it as a game. With that caveat out of the way, I do need to place the soundtrack for Tomb of the Lost Queen in the clearly great category. This ends up being because I feel like a lot of the tracks themselves end up feeling fairly similar and not necessarily distinctive based on particular moments within the mystery or locations throughout the game. I do love the instruments that were used within the soundtrack and how everything comes together to really truly get across the idea that we are in Egypt for this mystery, in the desert, wandering through the sand dunes in search of treasure. I definitely get that idea and that mood from the music itself, and I think it helps tell the story fantastically because of that. There are at times tracks that have a jauntiness to them that sort of evoke that idea of Egyptian royalty and the lavish lives that they led, while also including tracks that mesh perfectly with poking around in dark corners of a cursed tomb, never truly knowing what we could find next. There is a great mystery to the soundtrack, while also a great homage to the sands of time. It's clearly great, but sort of like White Wolf of Icicle Creek, a little too much of it ends up sounding too much the same. The Deadly Device. I seriously love this soundtrack. It has to go in pure perfection for me, because very similar to Alibi and Ashes, I can listen to it in the game or without the game and enjoy it at extremely high levels. It's just a very fun soundtrack and one that I really enjoy listening to in my free time. Because this game takes place in a very high-tech scientific space, the music itself is wonderfully techno, but not in a way that becomes repetitive or cliche at all. There is still so much personality to the music within this soundtrack that somehow sounds electric and yet also really nicely brings together the ideas of old scientific ideas and novel forward-moving thoughts. Because this is a murder mystery, the music, and even the really upbeat tracks, has this air of intensity and fear to it while still being extremely fun to listen to, which I just think is a serious accomplishment. Like, it manages to capture the mood of a murder mystery in a science lab, and yet still be really enjoyable, and even still have an air of history to it. It feels like something that wouldn't have been easy and very easily could have been basic and simple and boring, but it just isn't that, and I really end up loving the soundtrack. Ghost of Thornton Hall. I feel like my placement of this soundtrack might also be considered a little bit controversial because this is the first mystery that used a signature song to its fullest and most successful extent. Scarlet singing the Ladybug song is one of the most terrifying and haunting experiences, and that is something that will stick in my mind for always and eternity. The soundtrack is all so beautifully haunting the entire time. The foggy, dense, dark, mysterious, spooky vibe that this game has is due in no small part to the soundtrack, which is constantly doing the most to make us feel unsettled, unsure, and unsafe. I can't call it pure perfection because many of these tracks end up sounding very similar to one another, and because they are so scary, they don't necessarily make for great free time listening music, similar to the soundtrack for Shadow at the Water's Edge. While the music itself is near perfection for what it needs to accomplish, I enjoy it much more within the context of Thornton Hall and Black Rock Island than I do without, and so for me, I will leave it at amazing. The Silent Spy. This is another one that I could see being controversial for very similar reasons, because Kate's theme and the way that piano is used throughout this whole mystery to really convey Nancy's mom as a character and that whole entire subplot is really something special. This game uses music as part of the plot, and it does so successfully. The way that the piano is integrated into the entirety of the soundtrack, while also still being very much associated with Kate as a character, and therefore Nancy as a character as well, is just expert storytelling, particularly through music as a medium. I do also really like the Scottish-inspired tracks in that I think they convey Scotland beautifully and make great use of bagpipe, which is not a sentence that I ever really thought I would utter out loud, but I think it's true. At the same time, I think it's those bagpipe tracks, similar to the fiddle tracks in Haunting of Castle Malloy, that prevents this soundtrack from really becoming pure perfection for me personally, because that particular sound just ends up being more jarring for me than enjoyable as a soundtrack to listen to over and over again. There's absolutely nothing wrong with this soundtrack, it's just for me personally, I enjoy others more, and so I have to put it in the amazing category. Skipping the Shattered Medallion, we now move on to Labyrinth of Lies, which goes in the amazing category. This game really does the most when it comes to capturing the sounds of Greece and Greek culture. To someone who only peripherally knows what that sounds like, I feel like this is definitely what it's supposed to be. The individual tracks that feel very Greek and very upbeat and almost like a dance are very fun to listen to and offer a nice contrast to the ethereal underground sounds of the underworld tracks. I can certainly call to mind many of the tracks from this game and place them within the context of the locations of the game. I think the location of Greece itself was definitely conveyed through the music, but beyond that, I almost wonder about the music being used as part of the storytelling, and I feel like that's where it falls a bit short for me. It definitely sounds fantastic and does its job, helps set suspense in the right places and keep our intensity expectations in line. Do I find it just a little bit less memorable than some of the other soundtracks? Yes. So therefore, it isn't one that I could necessarily put in the pure perfection category. And lastly, we have Sea of Darkness, and you may have noticed that there is still one spot available in the Pure Perfection category, and that's where this game is going. This is another game that uses the signature song aspect flawlessly. The word I couldn't keep is a bop. It is extremely catchy and extremely beautiful. The lyrics are actually part of the mystery itself, as well as the individual notes of the song. And so the soundtrack itself becomes quite literally part of the story, which is something that I really appreciate. Some of the sailor songs get a little too close to being a bit bombastic for me, but they come back down so quickly and are contrasted so carefully and purposefully with these really gentle and peaceful songs that match the falling snow so marvelously and set the scene so expertly. Because when we think about it, we have raging volcanoes and crashing waves directly next to a peaceful land covered in silent snow. That contrast is played with really flawlessly, and each individual track meets up with the next in a way that brings a true cohesive nature to the soundtrack as a whole. I guess what I'm saying is that the balance between compare and contrast with each of the individual songs is spot on. And so what we end up with is a beautifully crafted soundtrack that can hit all of the different levels of intensity with painstaking accuracy. Plus, you will always find me singing along to The Word I Couldn't Keep, which just makes me so happy to be able to sing along with the Nancy Drew song. Also, friendly shout out to the two dossier games, Lights, Camera, Curses, and Resorting to Danger, who I don't include on this ranking purely because they are so different in style to the Nancy Drew games and are much simpler games overall. Therefore, I feel like it's unfair to try and compare them to the adventure games themselves. However, if I were to put the music for each of these tracks into the tiers, Resorting to Danger would rank higher for me. It would be either Pure Perfection or Amazing, simply because I'm obsessed with the spa music and it's just so soothing. Lights, Camera, Curses would be either clearly great or amazing. I do love the detective noir music and think that it works really nicely with the soundtrack, but I just don't find it quite as memorable as some others. So there you have it, fellow detectives. I did it! I managed to divide up my list of the Nancy Drew soundtracks, at least a bit. If I was truly forced to only pick 5 Nancy Drew soundtracks to listen to for the rest of my life, I think you'd find me desperately grabbing for Message in a Haunted Mansion, Ghost Dogs of Moon Lake, Curse of Blackmore Manor, and Warnings at Waverly Academy, with a knockdown dragout for the 5th spot, perhaps depending on my mood on the particular day. But when it comes down to it, I have nothing but celebratory applause for the Nancy Drew soundtracks as a whole. Kevin Manthei and Thomas Regan, I thank you deeply for crafting such beautiful and memorable soundtracks that really help the wonderful stories of these wonderful games come to life. And what do you think, fellow detectives? Do you agree with my rankings? What are your pure perfection soundtracks? Am I being too nice, or are the Nancy Drew soundtracks really that good? And while I'm here, I would also like to announce that I have just officially launched a Patreon to help support the channel as our community of fellow detectives continues to grow. Joining my Patreon as a patron is totally optional, but if you are interested in supporting the channel as we continue to grow, that choice is now available to you with 2 separate tiers, including a $5 tier and a $10 per month tier that includes exclusive content once a month. Also, if you sign up within the next month, I will send you a personalized postcard to express my thanks. And as always, please feel free to like, comment, subscribe, and hit that notification bell for more Nancy Drew and Sims 4 content. Thanks for watching, fellow detectives. I will see you soon.